Okay, so let's get cracking here on Seabiscuit, Third Emotion. So I think it's very strange. His nickname for Third Emotion is Cracker, and I don't understand. He gives in the beginning he gives a description of kind of like why it makes sense, but it seems to be like a metaphor that maybe makes sense in Russian, doesn't really translate as well. And the title itself ends up getting called Seabiscuit. I don't know why. Um, but yeah, I guess the nickname is something like someone who. It also, I see it get translated as breadcrumbs. And I'm imagining kind of like a prisoner with like stale bread, and they're kind of like maybe like self-denying, but in an emotional way. I'm not really sure how it fits, but I guess let's get into it. Okay, it's easy to describe cracker. The name itself suggests the colors for the palette. However, in this case, it would be completely wrong to use exclusively cold, monochromatic colors. Like any third, the third emotion feels constrained, but powerful potential within itself. And in cases where the timidity of emotional self disclosure can be overcome, fire and passion burst out from under the iceberg of cracker. However, such self disclosures do not mean a complete abolition of duality of feelings. This is how the philosopher N. Berdyaev, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, describes the state of his third emotion. I noticed the slightest shades and changes in mood, and at the same time, this hypersensitivity was combined in me with the fundamental dryness of my nature. My sensitivity is dry. Many have noticed this spiritual dryness of mine. I do not belong to the so called spiritual people. The lyrical element in me is weakly expressed, suppressed. In the emotional life of the soul, there was disharmony, often weakness. The very dryness of the soul was a disease. So I guess dry like a cracker. That makes sense. The third emotion is the most defenseless creature in the world. The third physics is at least protected from blows by the law. The third logic and the third will are protected from blows with sin and half by ethics. So I think what he's basically saying that the law and our institutional society kind of protects us from like physical harm, and to some extent we are protected from logical logical harm. But I guess you could say like being made fun of and being taken advantage of due to a insecure logic and insecure will. We're protected from that by our ethical and moral systems. But there is neither ethics nor law capable of even hypothetically taking up the defense of the cracker from the most painful for him of blows, hysterics, and emotional executions in general. Okay, so what he means by that is, hysterical people and also emotional attacks. Okay, the defenselessness of the third emotion in the face of a violent eruption of feelings is perceived by us as nothing more than an incident, an eccentricity, but not a personal drama. But in vain. There is real tragedy here, doubly painful because it is absolutely incomprehensible and invisible to others. Even such a great expert on the human soul as Leo Tolstoy has to approach the indifference to the pains of the third emotion. Recreating the image of the unfortunate Karenin in his famous novel, he is amazingly accurate in looking after the third emotion, but is still very far from understanding its nature and sympathy. Here is a typical passage. No one, except the people closest to Alexei Alexandrovitch, knew that this seemingly cold and reasonable person had one weakness, contrary to his great character. Alexei Alexandrovitch could not indifferently hear or see the tears of a child or woman. The sight of tears brought him into a confused state, and he completely lost his ability to reason. It is impossible not to give credit. Tolstoy's pen may be cold, but accurate in describing the vulnerability of the third emotion. I am ready to supplement it only with personal observation, which could well become information for a criminal chronicle, or at worst, a source of public censure, if we were not talking about emotional pressure. So, one of my friends, having felt her third emotion, was completely robbed by her own husband. Having observed her vulnerability to emotional pressure, he squeezed money out of her with tears until he had squeezed everything out. In response to the hysterical screams, she only had time to cover her ears and mutter, take everything, but for God's sake, shut up. The phrase, only without emotions, with which the cracker usually comes into conflict, even pronounced in a categorical tone, is in fact not a demand, but a secret plea for leniency towards weakness, a vain attempt to cover up a sore spot in a fight. Describing Karenin, Tolstoy is impeccably accurate in that when circumstances pick out the cracker from his icy shell, he, having let go of the constantly tense reins of feelings, suddenly begins to experience an unknown, even a little frightening satisfaction from the manifestation of his experiences. According to Tolstoy, Karenin, bending over the bed of his wife, preparing for death, suddenly felt that what he considered a mental disorder was, on the contrary, a blissful state of soul, which suddenly gave him a new, never experienced happiness. He stood on his knees, and resting his head on the crook of her hand, which was burning with fire through his jacket, sobbed like a child. However, as is clear, and rightly so, from Tolstoy's novel, episodes of openness of feelings are rare for the third emotion and have no continuation. Therefore, as a result, the cracker, in addition to being defenseless against emotional beatings, is often doomed to another torment, loneliness. Previously, speaking about ideas that tightly linked love and emotionality, it was already stated that the measure of love in humanity is experienced and observed feelings, and therefore the romantic, first emotion, is the best lover in the world. For the cracker, it's the other way around. He's the worst lover in the world. Outsiders usually generally deny him the ability to love, as contemporaries partly did in relation to Chekhov, arguing that there was no great love in Chekhov's life. But, according to a more accurate observation by Kuprin, the problem for Chekhov was not the content of feelings, but the form of expression. Kuprin wrote, "There lived in him a fear of pathos, strong feelings, and several theatrical effects inseparable from it. I can only compare his situation with one. Someone loves a woman with all the ardor, tenderness, and depth of which a person of subtle feelings, enormous intelligent and talent." Okay, let me read that again. I lost that one a little bit. I can only compare his situation with one. Someone loves a woman with all the ardor, tenderness, and depth of which a person of subtle feelings, enormous intelligence, and talent would, I guess. The translation's a little iffy there. But he will never dare to say about it in pompous words, and cannot even imagine. But how he will kneel down and press one hand to his heart, and how he will speak in the trembling voice of his first lover, and therefore he loves and is silent and suffers silently. Impenetrability is a word that most accurately conveys claims against the third emotion on the part of people who are close to it. During a casual acquaintance, attention is rarely paid to this trait. Crackers, in this situation, are extremely comfortable, reliable, interesting people, in whose company no serious discomfort is felt. Otherwise, things will develop with serious rapprochement, not to mention living together. The impenetrability of the third emotion reveals itself as a painful and even frightening trait. Imagine living with someone without a clear idea of how they feel about you. With a cracker, you can marry, have sex, raise children, build a house, and at the same time never know how he feels about you. A blank wall of emotional inexpressiveness rises in front of everyone for whom it is important to clarify their attitude towards themselves. At best, such an experimenter feels indifference to himself. At worst, hidden hostility, which in reality most likely does not exist. Not to say affection, even obviously expressed irritation, anger, can be more attractive than the grave peace with which the third emotion protects its vulnerable soul. Only when you find yourself next to a cracker do you understand how important an instrument in behavior and relationships is emotion, and how it can be lacking for the most basic coexistence, how painfully the chronic impenetrability of the cracker is experienced. Hell yes. Having been around people I've typed as 3E, that paragraph is so true. It's like I realize how much I actually appreciate, kind of emotionality, free emotionality, and like expressiveness to some extent when I'm around people like this. Because it honestly, and I'm biased because of my, psychotype, but it is unnerving, and it feels like walking on eggshells for myself, and it feels stifling. And I frankly just don't I don't have enough energy to deal with it. I think for second emotion types who are complementary to third emotion types, they have a certain energy and a certain, interest in exploring someone and pulling emotions out of people in a very like subtle, nuanced and deft way. But for me, I ain't doing that shit. So it's just kind of an uncomfortable experience. And I'm like, I thought I was someone who, you know, didn't have emotions or was emotionally stifled. And that's like I'm around, actually 3E people, and it's like, oh, wait a sec. No, 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 no. It's a little different than that. And we'll get to, 4E right after this. But yeah, it's like it seems like they are really holding back emotions, and there's just this woodenness and dryness, um, and again, like you said, not knowing how someone feels about you. And it's kind of like with 3Es, it's like they keep their relationship with you in like a superposition, where it's like, on one day it's like, oh yeah, I'm this guy's friend, and then on the next day you're like, well, maybe he doesn't really think I'm his friend. You never know, and it seems like easy for them to be like, well, actually, you're not my friend, and you never were. That kind of shit with 3Es, like that bothers me a lot. And yeah, it's just hard to, you can't, it's not like static where you stand with them. It seems like an ever fluctuating sort of thing. And I'm not a fan of that. But all third functions, third positions have their own problems. Um, so yeah, I just wanted to comment there that yeah, I can definitely relate to that paragraph in my experiences with 3Es. So moving on. In addition to the fact that the cracker rarely marries, he also reproduces poorly. Now, I think this part is just complete bullshit. Generally, when he talks about like children in relation to the functions, it just seems like you have to take it as an analogy and not as an actual literal thing, because it just does not at all match up to my experiences. At least, maybe you disagree. Maybe you'll find that it does in your experiences, but for me, I just can't believe it. So, in addition to the fact that the cracker rarely marries, he also reproduces poorly. The source of the problem was mentioned earlier: vulnerability to emotional pressure. Children have only one means of influencing the world: screaming and screaming. We already okay. We already know, and is the most painful means of influencing the third emotion. Hence, the cracker has a fear of childbirth and, as a consequence, infertility. Okay, so in other words, he has a fear of reproducing, and therefore he is infertile. One can only wonder how the third emotion survives in such conditions, but the fact remains that the crackers, albeit in small numbers, violating the principles of natural selection, continue to live among us, confirming the old idea that nature abhors a vacuum. Of course, I know some 3Es that have, 3, 4, 6 children, etc. So it's kind of like, man, I don't know about that. Um, the cracker himself is an ideal child. It's as if he was specially created for bad parents. The lack of freedom of expression of moods and pains given to him by nature itself frees parents from the need to be sensitive and attentive towards the child. When Bunin asks Chekhov's mother and sister if he had ever cried, both firmly answered, "Never in my life. Isn't it a perfect child?" However, this feature of the cracker has its downsides. The absence of dark colored emotions in a child with third emotion is balanced by the absence of light colored emotions. And when Prishvin said that he was born without a smile, he thereby stated not only the fact of his own misfortune, but also the misfortune of his parents. The impossibility of a wide open smile, free, loud laughter, is perhaps the biggest problem of the third emotion. One girl wrote to the psychiatrist, "I'm trying with all my might to create something like a smiley face. A grimace furiously widens my eyes. From the outside, it looks like a convulsive stretching of the corners of my mouth. Teach me to smile." Indeed, a stone smile, laughter either silent, like in Chekhov and Molotov, or taking the form of a giggle, like in Zoshenko and Robespierre, that's all that the third emotion usually manages to squeeze out of itself. The suppressed laughter of the cracker is especially noticeable against the background of the free cackle of the romantic. Kataev Remembering Zoshenko said, "In a world of blissful idleness, we become close to the staff captain, who turned out to be not at all as withdrawn as various memoirists later portrayed him," emphasizing that he is a great humorist, himself did not smile and was dry and gloomy. None of this is true. The God that united our souls was humor, which did not leave us for a minute. I, as usual, laughed loudly, as the key once remarked. Uh, Laughed, while the laughter of the staff captain could rather be called a restrained, poisonous laugh. I would even say ironic. He he he. Not really sure what that story is. It's kind of garbled in terms of the translation. So, despite the fact that from the outside the third emotion looks like a creature that laughs rarely and stifled, it has an innate humorous gift. More precisely, what we take to be the gift of humor is a combination of the two main components of the third emotion, processionalism and the fig leaf. That is, the need for constant emotional self-expressionism is not realized directly and openly, but under the cover of irony, the usual fig leaf for the third emotion. From these two components, the image of a cracker is formed as a poisonous, cynical person peering intently at the funny side of life, with an imperturbable air telling jokes that make the audience choke with laughter. This is how Buster Keaton and Mikhail Zoshenko are described, in their images adjusted for scale can be transferred to the image of the cracker as a whole. The imprint of constriction usually lies in the fruits of the humorous creativity of the third emotion, although by outside observers it is perceived not as a defect but as some kind of original form. For example, the famous English joke, specially designed not for cackle but for a thin, barely noticeable smile, is the fruit of the creativity of an Englishman who is not so much prone to originality as suffering from his emotional dryness. Okie dokie. In its external manifestations, cracker is the complete opposite of a romantic. There is nothing to contrast with the loudness of the first emotion of the third emotion, except for a smooth, poor modulation, close to muttering speech structure, as Chekhov spoke, according to Bunin's description. If the cracker dares to sing, then in this case too the monotony, narrowness of the band, and mechanical sound will make themselves felt. The gestures of the third emotion and facial expressions are also poor. I don't know why, but usually the timbre of a cracker's voice is shifted upward towards falsetto. Not sure about that one. The same contrast is in the details. If the handwriting of the first emotion is sweeping, airy, curly, then the handwriting of the third emotion is neat, collected, small, simple. If the punctuation of the first emotion is filled with bright, passionate signs, then the punctuation of the third emotion is even impassive and poor. As criticism correctly noted in one poem by Svitaiva, first emotion, there are more exclamation marks than in the entire work of Joseph Brodsky, third emotion. The opposite of the first emotion is the third emotion's understanding of the task of metaphor. Let us remember that Max Voloshin, being romantic, categorically argued that beer can be compared with the sea, but the sea cannot be compared with beer. However, many major poets, for example Joseph Brodsky, who loved to compare the ocean with a blanket, would obviously disagree with him. So who is right? Both are right, but each in their own way. The essence of the differences between the romantic and the cracker regarding metaphor is that in the view of the romantic, metaphor should work only in one direction, to increase the small, B or C, while the metaphorical prism of the cracker usually works in the opposite direction, to reduce the big one, to reduce the big, C to beer. In this regard, I will quote the famous description of a thunderstorm in Chekhov's The Steppe. To the left, as if someone had struck a match across the sky, a pale phosphorescent strip flashed and went out. I heard someone walking on an iron roof somewhere very far away. They probably walked barefoot on the roof because the iron grumbled dully. It is unlikely that you will find a more down-to-earth description, seen as if through inverted binoculars, of such a powerful and frightening in its scale phenomenon as a thunderstorm. Only the third emotion can recreate it in this way. Okay, that's interesting, and I don't have any comment on the veracity of that, but just this idea that, in keeping with the essential nature of the two functions, the first emotions kind of metaphorically swells the small to big, whereas the third emotion reduces the big to the small, conceptually. So maybe that's kind of interesting. Um, I remember discussing the manifestation of procession in the artistic creativity of the second emotion. I called this creativity akinical. So the third emotion is also processional, even super processional. Therefore, Cracker is super Akin. I think Joseph Brodsky should be recognized as an amazing example of such a super Akin. The endless flows of his poems, like a waterfall, where the ends of the lines and stanzas are not ends in the proper sense of the word, but steps through which an inexhaustible current of words rolls, recording almost every minute the slightest shades of the poet's moods. This is Brodsky's style, exemplarily reflecting the originality of the artistic appearance of the works of the third emotion. Another paradoxical, in the opinion of literary studies, feature that unites poets with the third emotion is that, being the finest lyricists, they find themselves on the sidelines of the main lyrical theme, love. Before Brodsky appeared, this circumstance was noted as an incident in the work of Zabolotsky and Tardovsky. Oh, jeez. However, if literary criticism had taken a closer look, it would have discovered in their works not only the absence of a clearly expressed love theme, but also signs of feverish passion as such, regardless of the content. The programmatic slogan for the third emotion in general, not only busy literature, can be considered the classic phrase of Turgenev's Bazarov, friend Arkady, don't speak beautifully. If we turn to the genre preferences of the Cracker, then in any kind of artistic activity, he is, first of all, a landscape painter and an animal painter. Yeah, so this part coming up is pretty interesting. I don't know about literally so, but as an analogy, it's maybe useful. So I will say more. The brightest sign of the third emotion in general, regardless of the nature of the activity, is the openly demonstrated passion, love for nature and animals. Berdyaev, not sure, explained the source of this passion as follows. It was easy for me to express my emotional life only in relation to animals. I poured out all the reserve of my tenderness on them. My exceptional love for animals may be connected with this. This love of a person who has the need for love but can hardly express it in relation to people. This is the flip side of loneliness. Here, as in many other cases, a reservation should be made. The vulnerability of the third emotion is such that the Cracker tries to cover up and disguise his holy passion for animals, for nature, masquerading as either a hunter or a fisherman, Prishvin and Paustovsky. It seems to Sukhar that the breadwinner's mask reliably hides his weakness, but that's not true. The usual indifference to the results of hunting or fishing for the third emotion betrays it completely. One day, standing with a spinning rod by the river, President Bush complained that he usually goes without a catch. Then what are you doing here? They asked him. I love casting and I love fishing, Bush replied. This is the kind of vague answer that the third emotion has to give when it comes to the origins of her strange, unprofitable hobby. Although in the section devoted to third emotion, quite a lot was said about her artistic preferences, the Cracker rarely chooses the artistic, religious, mystical, entertainment field, and moreover often diligently avoids it, showering representatives of artistic professions with the cold of irony and poorly concealed disdain. If we talk about a career that nature itself seems destined for Cracker, then it will be the career of a diplomat. I don't know how, but the idea has developed that a great diplomat is the kind of person that if you kick him in the ass at a diplomatic reception, the interlocutor will not read anything on his stony face. God knows where this idea came from and how often a diplomat gets his ass kicked, but it is obvious that the Cracker is suitable for this role like no one else. The power of public opinion, even empty, even wild, is limitless. Therefore, the innate equanimity of the third emotion really often leads it to the diplomatic field and practically guarantees, regardless of other qualities, a highly professional assessment. Molotov. From the career of a diplomat, there is a direct road to the career of a politician. But in the event of such a change of fields, the third emotion, which previously worked as a plus, begins to work as a minus, especially lately. The problem is that the current democratization of political life and the rapid growth of the influence of the media on it, which have made the ordinary voter the master of political destiny, have placed an almost insurmountable barrier on the path of the cracker politician, a test of emotionality. The apparent insensitivity, the imaginary inability to empathize, the boring speeches of the third emotion force the voter to look at it with suspicion and hostility. Therefore, even when the third emotion manages to break through to the helm of power, as with Thatcher and Bush, its representatives are respected, feared, appreciated, but not loved. So there you go. That's third emotion.